There's already a ton of buzz around Resident Evil 9 Requiem. With its release just over a month away as of the recording of this video, there is a bunch of speculation going around, and one theory that's piqued my interest is the fate of Leon S. Kennedy, and whether or not he will die in this game, something bad will happen to him, or he will have a happy ever after ending in this title. But honestly, after almost 3 decades of surviving parasites, political drama, and bioweapons, it's not the craziest idea if they end up bringing his story to a closure, regardless of what way they go about doing that. A lot of long-time fans are starting to wonder if Requiem is meant to be Leon's final ride, not just another chapter in his story. Capcom hasn't confirmed anything, but once you start looking at the setup, it actually makes a surprising amount of narrative sense. Leon started out as an optimistic cop, and he was a rookie on his first day during the Raccoon City outbreak. Fast forward to today, and now he's a broken, exhausted, extremely skilled government agent who's seen more trauma than anyone signed up for. The recent games have been leaning into the fact that he has been worn out over time, with Resident Evil 4's remake making it extremely clear he's still haunted by Raccoon City's incidents, and that of course took place over the course of Resident Evil 2, and Resident Evil 6 leaning into how tired he is of the political side of these BOW outbreaks and global crises as a whole. Even his humour has turned more cynical over time, and this is only the top of the iceberg as to how much this man has gone through. If Capcom did kill him, it wouldn't just be shock value, it would definitely feel like the end of a long and extremely complex character arc that's been building ever since the original Resident Evil 2, and it would open the door for new characters to take over as the face of the franchise, which Capcom has already been testing with Ethan, Rose, and a couple of other characters, so it would be interesting if they did go down this approach. And then of course we have the fan theory that exploded after trailers surfaced, revolving around Leon maybe losing his hand. There are a few shots where he's hiding it, favouring it, or just suspiciously not showing it, and Capcom does love their visual foreshadowing like this. Ethan losing fingers in Village was practically symbolic of his decay, and if Leon really does lose a hand, it could be Capcom's way of saying he's not invincible anymore, he's aging, and he's just vulnerable for once, which we've never actually seen him at that point. He's always had a way to get out of the terrible situations that he finds himself in, and more importantly, it doesn't set him up for another trilogy of adventures. You don't just lose a hand and go backpacking across Europe fighting BOWs for another decade. Of course, they could go with the route that he potentially loses his hand, but then gets some kind of prosthetic to replace it that works perfectly fine. It is, of course, a fictional universe, so I wouldn't put it past them. But I feel like if he does lose his hand, I don't see the point of them making that the case if they're just going to replace it with something just as capable. So that's definitely something that's piqued my interest when I was looking over what Capcom have released so far and where the community discussion has been heading. And while I feel like Leon dying in Requiem is a very unlikely possibility, I think it's not just a question of whether it fits, but definitely one that is questioning how it would contrast with the other legacy characters, and I feel like the primary counterpoint or counterexample here is Chris Redfield. Chris is arguably the character who would more traditionally suit a heroic battlefield death, with him being that soldier archetype, having that final stand, protecting civilians and possibly the world most likely, and this would of course align seamlessly with the tone his character has carried ever since the original Resident Evil. But as for Leon, I feel like death would serve a different narrative function. It would be less about battlefield glory and more about thematic closure. Where Chris dying would symbolise duty fulfilled, Leon dying surely would symbolise trauma resolved, an end to the psychological burden that began in Raccoon City that has never truly left him, given he was just a rookie when he had to experience all of the events in Resident Evil 2. And as I said, this would definitely be a strong contrast and reinforce why Leon's potential death would hit so differently, and arguably even more so than Chris's, as I feel like Chris's probably would be more of a monumental death and it would be publicly known, whereas Leon's, given his role over these games where he is a much more secretive government agent, it wouldn't be as known to the world as to how much impact he's had, and it would be less about saving the world publicly and more about saving it in the background while closing this traumatic wound that's just under 3 decades old and one that he's had to live with ever since the original Resident Evil 2. And if Capcom does decide against killing Leon outright, and of course they do make this his final game, which I feel like is a 50-50 chance, but I'm starting to lean towards more so that this game is going to be his closure, given we are returning to Raccoon City and Leon looks noticeably older in the trailers that we've seen so far. I feel like retirement or a symbolic fade out remains the next most likely route. What fans don't always acknowledge is that Leon was never designed as a James Bond figure who endlessly regenerates and looks fantastic and is always on top of his game. They have actively been making Leon look more and more worn out every time he appears into future installments, whether that's a movie or in the games, where he does start to look more and more burnt out with everything he's had to deal with in his life since that Raccoon City incident, and I feel like his innocence was destroyed in those events, and the remakes definitely highlight this, and it does truly showcase itself as an event that would realistically, as you would expect, shape the entire trajectory of his life. After RE2, every step Leon takes is contaminated by what happened on day one of his career. The outbreak defined his identity, his government recruitment stripped him of his normal future, and then every subsequent bioterror event mirrors or rhymes with Raccoon City, endlessly reminding him of what he had to deal with. Even his relationships reflect the shadow of Raccoon City, with his unresolved dynamic with Ada Wong, the burden he carries in RE4, and his inability to distance himself from government obligations, all stemming from that formative disaster. So I wouldn't be too surprised if this game is truly his final chapter, and I feel like retiring Leon, whether that is through death, disappearance, or voluntary withdrawal, would give him something that he has literally never had in the series, and that is finality. I think that the answer to this question as to whether or not Capcom will pull the trigger on one of their most, if not their most beloved character in the franchise, depends on Capcom's risk appetite. Killing Leon would be controversial, emotional, and definitely unforgettable, the kind of decision that cements a game's legacy, but it could also ruin it, so I definitely don't think they would be killing him off. But I do think that all of us should be prepared for the Resident Evil compromise, that while Leon might not die, he might not return or have much more minor roles in future games where he's potentially a mentor to a future character. For example, if he does lose his hand, I'm hoping they don't give it back, and that way he can just be sidelined but still be there as guidance for those future characters. Of course, if they do go with the death, this will close his arc off, and I'm sure it will be extremely poetic given we're moving back to Raccoon City. But I hope they do go with the retirement route, and it just gives him a nice closure storyline to all of the events he's had to endure. Either outcome, I think, definitely will push the franchise forward, and after 28 years of service, both to the US government and, of course, to us fans, Leon, I feel like, has truly earned his ending. Whether it's a grave, a cabin in the woods, or a quiet exit from the bioterror world, Requiem feels like the final act he's been unknowingly walking towards since the night Raccoon City burned to the ground. And with that said, guys, that does bring us to the end of this video. Definitely drop your thoughts down below as to what you think about Leon's fate in this Resident Evil game that's just over a month from releasing as of the recording of this video, and I look forward to reading how the discussion continues. As always, a like would be extremely appreciated if you did enjoy. It does help out the channel a ton, and subscribe for a lot more Resident Evil content. Don't forget to join our Discord, link is at the top of the description, and thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.